Hey everybody, Nick Espinoza, your chief security fanatic here. Don't forget to subscribe. And today we are talking about the CVE database. You may not know what it is, but understand when it comes to your security, specifically your cybersecurity and data security, it is beyond important, not just here in the United States, but everywhere in the world. And so with that, let's dive in because we've had some major news happen in the last 24 hours. And so, with that, as always, we're going to start with the ground rules here. If you are listening to this on the radio or podcast or anywhere else, I highly suggest you go to my YouTube channel as this is a presentation that you're not going to want to miss. And so, first things first, this is not political. I do not care what your politics are. I love to say that cybersecurity is agnostic to politics, but we're not immune from it. And I think this is one of those cases. And so I don't care. We're just going to talk about the facts and stick with it. So, with that, these are the facts that we know as of basically Wednesday, April 16th, 2025, around 4 p.m. Central Daylight. I'm actually recording this a little earlier than that, but I just want to be fair in case I don't get this pumped out until then. So here we are. But these are the facts as we know it. And also, it's important to remember that basically we need to have actual facts in situations like this. So please, by all means, feel free to Google yourself. Feel free to look at top tier sources and review all of the information that I'm about to talk about. And so with that, let's dive in to the CVE. But first, here's why we're actually talking about this. Because on April 15th, Tuesday, this letter that you see here on your screen was basically sent to the CVE board members, and it states that the CVE program will essentially lose its funding on April 16th, 2025. This has been confirmed by multiple sources. So I personally reached out to somebody I know, Ed Miter, who did confirm this for me. Brian Krebs, the cybersecurity writer, also confirmed this, as did others. So this is actually happening, and right now it is April 16th, which means the funding has stopped for this. And so this is beyond critical, as I mentioned. And so let's dive into the nuts and bolts of this and simply start with what on earth is the CVE database? And it's really this simple. CVE, or Common Vulnerabilities and Exposures, is essentially just a publicly accessible list of known cybersecurity vulnerabilities that is maintained by MITRE, known as the MITRE Corporation, but everybody just calls them MITRE, in coordination essentially with various global partners. And so with that, each vulnerability that is listed by, let's say, the software maker, I'm going to use an example like Microsoft, for example. Every time Microsoft has a vulnerability, essentially it gets entered into the database and it's assigned a unique identifier. So usually the way this works out in terms of nomenclature is it's entitled CVE dash and then the year 2025, and then basically a 4-digit or 5-digit number after that. That basically serves as a universal reference for tracking and discussing vulnerabilities. If I'm looking up vulnerabilities, so let's say I have a software or hardware product that has a known vulnerability and it says, oh, here's the CVE. I can Google that. I can immediately find the CVE database or other people talking about this and understand exactly what that CVE is. And so it's very handy when we are trying to figure out how to fix vulnerabilities, as there's details in the CVE database based on specific reference number. This ensures that essentially we are not making mistakes and mistaking one vulnerability for another. Pretty much every major software, and hardware maker essentially has vulnerabilities listed here. This is a very common, universally known thing in technology itself. And so as you've got that firewall or wireless access point or hardware in a server, computer, phone, whatever, Android, iOS, Windows, Linux, take your pick. They're all here. And it's super, super important that we keep maintaining that. And so with that, we know the funding was cut, but let's talk about who actually funds the CVE database. So essentially, it's funded by the US government right now. CISA, the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, which is part of Homeland Security, is the main source of the funding for the CVE database. It is basically part of the United States' national cybersecurity mission. So CISA funds MITRE to ensure that the CVS database is public, updated, and essentially accessible for everybody in the world. This is a public service that the United States has brought to the world that has helped ensure that we are more secure. And I don't care where you are in the world, everybody can use this. It's open to everybody. A MITRE Corporation, for the record, is a nonprofit and it does operate this, as I mentioned before. But again, I want to reiterate this because I know people at MITRE. I think they're doing excellent work over there. And quite frankly, it is going to be depressing if this goes away. Now, MITRE runs basically this database as what is known as an FFRDC, or Federally Funded Research and Development Center, and that is contractually obligated to the US government. That's essentially how this operates. The US government, under the umbrella of Homeland Security, specifically cybersecurity infrastructure, funds this to ensure that we have this for the world. And so the question then is, why do we fund it? Why does the US government fund it? So first things first, as I've mentioned multiple times already, this is national and global cybersecurity. It is beyond critical to what we are doing here. On top of it, helping to standardize and share vulnerability information essentially is that rising tide that raises all boats. It improves national security, basically the relationships and the readiness between the public and private sector to respond to cyber threats. The government knows something about, let's say, a vulnerability in a major firewall or whatever it is, and it's not telling anybody else, and we don't have a centralized way to really look at this. Well, that becomes much harder to figure out that we've got a vulnerability and update it. And we'll talk about different methodologies as well, because I know some of you that are watching this or listening to this are formulating those questions. And so with that, let's dive deeper into this because we've talked about essentially who funds this, why we've got it, but why is it so important? And I think that's really something to understand because most people don't get why this is so critical. The first major point that I could think of as I was just essentially just coming up with this, and this took a good chunk of time since yesterday, but I really wanted to just put into writing why this is so important. And quite frankly, standardization of naming, I think, is one of the most important things that we can talk about here because these IDs that CVE generates essentially is creating that common language as a reference. And so essentially everybody, vendors, researchers, users, everybody now has a common framework to understand, we are talking about this specific vulnerability and what this vulnerability does and how we can fix it. And there's no confusion on that. It also, as I just said, prevents that kind of confusion and ensures consistency. On top of this, it also helps basically prioritizing and patching and all that kind of stuff. And my slide screwed up, but it enables threat prioritization. That's one of the things it does because security teams that have this threat prioritization can use the CVE entries to essentially look at severity and exploitability. And so it then helps in prioritizing patching and mitigation efforts based on risk, especially when we're combining them with CVSS scores or common vulnerability scoring system scores. If you're scoring a 0, it's informational. If you're scoring a 10, oh my God, fix it immediately. So with that, let's keep on going because the CVE database also supports vulnerability management and compliance as well. And so basically, if you're looking at things like NIST 800-171 or the CMMC for the military, ISO 27001, PCI for credit cards and all of that, the CVE basically helps with this because organizations are actively identifying, assessing, and remediating known vulnerabilities, aka the patch management solutions that they've got. This helps with that. And so on top of it, this also facilitates automation and integration because if you're looking at it, a lot of the security tools, including the ones that we use here at Security Fanatic, are constantly referencing the CVE database as known vulnerabilities are found. So as we understand what the vulnerability does and we're probing it with, let's say, vulnerability scanners or testers, we can now marry that to a CVE database to see where we are or are not out of compliance. And so if you have automated detection on your network for vulnerability, the CVE database is that reference, that is the go-to for these platforms around the world. On top of it, it also supports research and threat intelligence. And I think that is beyond important. If we're going to stay ahead of essentially those attackers, those criminals that are innovating, we have to make sure that we are maintaining a known vulnerability so that we can start tracking these things. Search researchers, analysts, threat intelligence teams are using the CVE database to study essentially trends of exploitation, malware campaigns, zero-day vulnerabilities, and essentially this strengthens overall defensive strategies because again, we have that common language. And there's more. I really put thought into this. This also promotes coordinated disclosure. Think about it this way. if we've got CVEs, oftentimes they result from coordinated vulnerability disclosures between researchers and vendors, ensuring that security flaws are addressed and basically documented. And I think that's really important. Look at things like bug bounty programs when the Microsofts or Googles or whomever of the world, that's HackerOne. Like, so let's say a researcher finds a vulnerability in a Microsoft product. Again, just using them as an example, but this applies to any organization that is developing. They find a vulnerability, they can go to platforms like HackerOne and say, hey, I want to coordinate with Microsoft. The researcher makes money. Microsoft learns about basically a hole or a vulnerability in their software, and they're able to patch it. And then a CVE is released to the world so that we all know, oh wow, we really should be patching our Microsoft Word or whatever it is. This is so unbelievably important. And so with that, let's talk about what happens if the CVE goes away. Because if it were to suddenly disappear, stop functioning, et cetera, I think this would be significant to the global cybersecurity community. It's going to be disruptive. Vulnerability management systems and coordination are going to be a complete mess. And so let's talk about those consequences. I think one of the big one is the loss of a universal language. I think that is the biggest one that we've got. If we cannot keep and maintain on the same page, that's a huge problem because, quite frankly, this is how we're ensuring that when we are talking about a vulnerability in like a Microsoft or Cisco or Fortinet or Palo Alto or take your pick, that essentially we're on the same page. We lose that language, it makes it much harder basically to maintain essentially coordination. On top of it, there would be no standardized way to refer to vulnerabilities because the CVE has been basically that way that we've created. And we'll talk about others, but this is the most important one that we've got. On top of it, again, as I just mentioned, conflicting or duplicate names leading to confusion, miscommunication, and on and on and on. And there's more too, because I think this would essentially disrupt vulnerability management programs as well. You might have a program in your corporation or organization or whatever you're doing that says, okay, we're maintaining consistency, against the CVE to ensure that we're patching our Microsoft products, our Cisco products, our whatever, and here we are. Right? If those things cannot be quickly and easily referenced, then you may have to do this in just a really haphazard kind of way, because the CVE allows us to prioritize, especially when you pair it with CVSS scoring, on how and what we should be patching ASAP. There have been some major patches that have come out where it's like, wow, we are going to ask for forgiveness, not permission, to patch this for, clients or internally or whatever it is, because we know it's bomb dropping. Thank you, CVE disclosures. Thank you, CVSS. So this is a huge thing. On top of it, think about those security tools, those vulnerability management testers, platforms, change management systems that depend on this. This could essentially break most of the utilities out there. If they find a vulnerability but can't compare it against a common language like the CVE database, that's a huge problem. We are less secure if this thing goes away. And on top of it, the breakdown of coordination for disclosure, I think, is going to be a huge issue as well. Obviously, as I mentioned before, researchers and vendors use CVEs to track disclosures and sign responsibilities. And so if it goes away, it becomes a lot harder. And without that central registry, coordination between the finder of the vulnerability, the vendor that has the vulnerability, and the public, meaning you and I that are now reading about the vulnerability to secure ourselves by fixing that vulnerability, there's going to be delays. There's going to be things that we're inevitably going to miss because the system has already been put into place to ensure that we won't. And that's what we are losing here. I think that is such a huge thing. Compliance and regulatory gaps are another major issue that we're going to have as a result of this. Think about this. I just talked about ISO 27001 or the umbrella of NIST 800-171 as a cybersecurity framework, PCI for credit cards. They all are going to be referencing basically CVEs to track vulnerabilities, for risk assessments, to understand, where the vulnerabilities lie in a system. And so that's a huge issue as well. And so I think that the absence of the CVE data would essentially hinder organizations from meeting compliance. You can't 100% guarantee that you have patched everything if you don't have a common reference and framework to judge it against. That's the huge, huge issue. And there's more. We're not done. because fragmentation of intelligence feeds is going to be an issue as well. We have things like ISACs for information sharing and all of that. And quite frankly, that's going to be a huge issue because the threat ID vendors or threat intelligence vendors and researchers often tag IOCs or indicators of compromise with the CVEs. So in other words, if we understand, oh, how did the attackers got in? They got in because of vulnerability, CVE, et cetera, and here we are. If that goes away, again, it makes it harder essentially to basically feed that into common threat intelligence feeds like ISACs, and so that's a huge problem. So without the CVEs, if we're looking at correlation, exploits, malware, vulnerabilities become much harder to essentially ID, and so lower detection and response is simply the name of the game then. It's a huge problem that we're going to have. And this it applies to the White House, it applies to your house and everything in between. On top of it, patch management, security automation issues as well. As I mentioned, so many software vendors use CVEs to communicate patches and advisories. So I can basically look at the advisory, I can Google for more information on a common vulnerability that everybody is talking about in my world. So unbelievably important, not to mention the automation that relies on these identified CVEs for detection, prioritization, and remediation. These types of things would start to fail. So, in other words, the mean time to patching is going to be longer, which means exposure of vulnerability by organization is going to be longer. It's really that simple. On top of it, we have increased risk of exploitation. If it is taking us longer to basically patch things because we don't have a common framework, it's obviously going to basically increase our risk of exposure and exploitation. And so this disorganization, I think, would result in slower patching, miscommunication, less situational awareness. All of this favors the criminals. This is what we're talking about. This is a huge, huge issue. This would be a vacuum in vulnerability tracking that would easily be exploited by threat actors. This is a huge problem. And so, if this goes away, I think this is a major blow, not just to the cybersecurity community, but to all of us. You have a personal device in your life. Odds are you're listening or watching to me, watching me on your iPhone or your Android, or maybe your laptop on Windows or your desktop computer, or a MacBook or whatever it is. All of these things have vulnerabilities registered in the CVE right now. And it ensures that your iPhone, your MacBook, your Windows, your whatever is patched and updated. And when Apple or Microsoft or whomever says, hey, you really need to update your iOS and your iPhone or your Windows 10 or 11 or whatever you've got, they're basing it off of this. The common framework that they have published is in CVE. This is a huge issue, and it just lost its funding as I am sitting here talking to you today, April 16th. So the question then becomes, what on earth can we do if this happens? So no matter what the solution that we have, if CVE dies right now, and I don't know how long MITRE has funding wise, maybe it's a week, maybe it's a month, maybe they'll find more funding. I don't know. We'll talk about that. But this would take significant time and coordination to stand up another CVE. The fragmentation of this would be inevitable. So think about this. Let's dive in to see what happens here. First things first, we could stand up an independent community-driven replacement. I think there are some potential issues with that. It relies literally on a community of usually volunteers that are not going to get paid. So people are going to come and go, which means quality could potentially suffer. CVE is funded. So that's a huge thing. We also have open source foundations that could help with this. We have Linux, OWASP is a big one as well. Apache, one of these could kind of step in and kind of launch that. But again, quality control would be my concern. We also have crowdsourcing, basically, of infrastructure and governance to ensure transparency, resilience, broad participation. But again, when you're dealing with volunteers, I think it's a bit of an issue. So the next major one that we could do is establish a global consortium, basically outside of the United States. If the US government is slashing funding, we've seen this with the Department of Government Efficiency, where they're cutting funding to pretty much everything stem to stern, health, you name it. And again, not getting political, that's literally what is happening. Then maybe establishing a global consortium outside the United States' leadership, I think might be a pretty good idea. So think about it. We have, and I did throw NIST in here as well, even though that's US based, and we're expecting them to lose funding too. But, the European Union, Japan, and other major countries have essentially something that is like this. And so we could essentially basically create what I'm thinking is a multi-stakeholder consortium to essentially govern this and ensure that, if we've got essentially funding coming from multiple sources, no one dropping out would have an issue or a hindrance here. So it would prevent over-reliance on just one entity, in this case, the US government or a country like the USA, and essentially promote the sustainability of this. I think that would be a great idea, but there's more. We can also fall back on alternative databases. Right now, we have a couple of them. So basically, until we figure out a long-term fix, we already have the National Vulnerability Database. It is not as comprehensive as CVE. It does add NVS, or I'm sorry, CVSS scoring to this, the Common Vulnerability Scoring System, but that is kind of stood up. It's just not as robust as CVE. Same with OSV, or Open Source Vulnerability Database, as well. This is what Google runs. Again, not a fan of having a singular channel for that. If Google decides not to publish their own vulnerabilities for some reason, then Android users may suffer, et cetera, et cetera. So I'd rather have it done by a group that would be more independent than one corporation. But Google is running one, and they are big and they are well funded. So here we go. On top of it, we also have VulnDB. This essentially is commercial, but I think it might be able to fill the gaps in the interim. But again, you're going to have some people or some testing platforms, like vulnerability management, say, "Oh, I'm going to hook up with NVD or OSV or VulnDB," or now we're going to have a cocktail of all of them. And what if NDV has different nomenclature than VulnDB, which they're going to have for this specific vulnerability? How are we keeping this ordered and straight? That's why CVE was so unbelievably important. We also have just the traditional vendor advisories, right? So Microsoft finds an issue, they're going to release it to the world. Cisco finds it. Think about all of the vendors in your life. Now you'd have to go individually and say, okay, what is Microsoft saying today? Or what is Microsoft emailing to me today? And is all of this email already ending up in your spam filter because you're getting them every single day from a bazillion vendors? I think that's worst case scenario, but that will always be there. And that is the one that just takes legwork. Maybe we can throw AI on that. So I think this is a problem. And as you can see, while we have alternatives, just how important CVE is. And so with that, my quick thoughts and my opinions on this, because I want to separate fact from fiction. These are my thoughts on this. First things first, this is, as I've mentioned throughout this, beyond critical to the health of cybersecurity programs worldwide. I don't care if it's governmental, if it's if it's a corporation, if it's a mom and pop coffee shop in Mumbai, India. We all need cybersecurity in our lives. We all need a common system that allows us to understand that the vulnerability in Mumbai is the same as it is here in Chicago. So super, super important. On top of it, think about it this way. And this is the best way, and I put this out on LinkedIn yesterday, but the best way I can think about it is this. If you're still not understanding me, think about this. You own a car. Maybe it's a Ford, a GM, a Mercedes, a Subaru, whatever it is. Every car maker basically reports their issues and recall notices in the United States to NHTSA, the National Highway Transportation Security Agency. This is literally what they do. Ford has a problem with their steering wheel, they're going to report it to NHTSA. Mercedes has an issue with their brakes, NHTSA. Subaru has a problem with whatever, NHTSA. Everything goes to NHTSA. And by virtue of that, we have a one-stop shop. So your car, basically, you have a car and it's reporting your issues to NHTSA as well as sending you notifications. If NHTSA were to go away, let's say that were to die, imagine having to track your vehicle independently. So you're waiting for Subaru or whoever to send you snail mail or possibly an email that's going to your spam to basically say, you've got a recall, you've got an issue, you've got a notice. Where NHTSA makes it very easy for you to instantly go and say, I have a 2000 whatever, Mercedes, Ford, GM, Subaru, Toyota, whatever, and search it. That's what we're talking about here, where you can go at will and look at it. Now, imagine you owned 112 different car models, all different models from 90 different car makers around the world. Try keeping track of that. On average, we have 112 applications, SaaS or on-prem, from 90 different makers around the world, software makers around the world. Try keeping track of that. Not to mention the hardware. You have network switches, access points, firewall, IoT devices, everything, all feeding into the CVE database. Try tracking all of this yourself. That's what we are talking about here when CVE goes away. So moving forward, I think MITRE, or maybe just the CVE database itself, should be funded by various sources globally to ensure that if, one source decides to leave, like the United States government that's been funding the whole shebang decides to go, the work doesn't stop. It keeps rolling. If we had 10, let's say, governments and corporations all volunteering money into this thing, and essentially, let's say Germany pulls out or whatever, well, everybody else will keep it running until Germany straightens up and joins us again. That kind of thing. And in this case, we have a single government funding what is essentially used by the world and standardized throughout the world to ensure that we have good vulnerability management and cyber hygiene. This is a huge, huge thing. On top of it, this genuinely, I think, makes the world less secure. It undermines the dominant position that the United States has historically held in the cybersecurity community. We have been leaders in cybersecurity. Silicon Valley is here in the United States. And if we give up that position, I think that overarchingly makes us weaker in the world on the cybersecurity front. And quite frankly, I think that's a hindrance to everybody. And that's not some pro-American, anti-American sentiment. Again, I'm not getting political here. It's just that we have so much technology, infrastructure, and development coming from this country. We should have a leadership position in the fixing of the vulnerabilities of everything that is being developed within these borders that is being shared by the world. I think that is so unbelievably important. And with that, thank you very much for watching. I hope you watch this, or if you're listening to this, thank you for listening. Again, the CVE database is beyond important. If you want to get involved with this, I don't know if they're taking donations, but you can contact your member of Congress if it'll do any good, whatever. But the point is that if we lose the CVE database, we are all going to be less secure, myself included. And so with that, thanks again. And as always, here we are. And please like, share, follow me here on Facebook and Twitter at NickAESP. And please feel free to subscribe to me at YouTube as well. And as always, stay safe, stay online, and please, please, please attempt to stay private, secure, and informed. Take care.